For more on Iowa and how it might shape the rest of the U.S. presidential election season, we're joined by Edward Ashbee. He's the author of the book, The Right and the Recession. He's live from the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. He's associate professor in the Department of Business and Politics there. Edward, why don't I start with your book? Because I was reading, you write a lot about the right, not just here in the United States, but the UK and the response to the recession. And when you look at the Tea Party and these outsider candidates, Ted Cruz did very well last night, but not just Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, Ben Carson. If you combine all their numbers, about 61% of the vote. What does that tell us?
It tells us it's the age of the outsider, and what we're seeing in the United States is very similar to what we're seeing in some European countries, both on the left and particularly the right. We've got people who are anti-establishment making the running.
And you mentioned on the left as well, we know that Bernie Sanders did very well last night, people feeling the burn, as they say here in the United States. He also has a very anti-establishment, let's take on Wall Street attitude, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's something we see in Europe. Opposition, for example, to the kind of financial deals that the European Union was imposing on Greece, for example, or whatever it might be. We're seeing a similar hostility to many of the financial interests, both in Europe and in the United States.
We tend to get into the weeds here in the United States, so I'd like to get an international perspective from somebody outside the U.S. border. How are international watchers looking at this caucus results and the election in general, considering the fact that Cruz is seen to have a big victory and yet he only got about 43,000 votes?
Yeah. I think this is just about the point where over on this side of the Atlantic, people are beginning to take an interest in what's going on. But it's still not the same sort of interest that we saw 8 years ago, of course, when Barack Obama was in the race. Now Barack Obama's name is not on the ballot. At this stage, there seems to be much less interest in what's going on. Having said that, the events of last night, and in particular, of course, Donald Trump's fate, is something that does attract interest and comment.
Let me ask you about the recession, about what happened on Wall Street. And since you've researched this, what are the ripple effects of all of this?
Yeah.
Are we still going to see this for some time? Because you mentioned the UK, European countries, this kind of rage that's out there that these candidates are tapping into.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it stems from the nature of the so-called recovery from the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Instead of the kind of recovery that some had forecast, what we've seen, of course, has been very lackluster growth. And more importantly, even where there has been growth, it hasn't really had an effect on people's living standards, their take-home pay. And because of that, on both continents, as I said earlier, we've got people turning to these outsider candidates. They're fed up with politics as it has been practiced for a long time.
Edward,
having said that, yeah.
I was just going to say, I'd like to get your prediction on things because I know you watch this closely. I was reading your blog. You talked about Scott Walker. You talked about how basically Jeb Bush is handcuffed by the legacy of his brother and father. But it seems like there's a flavor of the month. It's Scott Walker one month. It's Ben Carson the next month. It's Donald Trump. Now Ted Cruz riding high. What do we read into all of this? Is there going to be another flavor of the month?
Well, probably we've established the top three runners on the Republican side. I think it's difficult to see anybody but the top three now making a play for it. And of course, the Republican establishment, if you use that word, has been cheered, as your reporter said, by Marco Rubio's very, very surprising result. He's the big winner of the evening. And there is now a hope that Marco Rubio can just go in the middle there between Cruz and Trump. Both of them may have their problems in the primaries and caucuses to come, and Marco Rubio can be the candidate at the end of the day.
Edward Ashbee joining us from Copenhagen. Thanks so much for your insights. Appreciate it.